There are a lot of reasons for Trump to be doing what he's doing with Putin. I mean, he doesn't like the EU. He wants the EU to go away because they are a strong, coordinated group with trade competency that undermines his influence on the global stage. He wants to deal with a bunch of individual, smaller, weaker countries much more than he wants to deal with the EU. And by the way, Putin agrees with that completely.
Isn't this just a downward spiral?
I really don't like the fact that the United States is setting the example for kleptocracy.
Ian, where does this podcast find you?
I am in New York at my office and in the middle of the maelstrom that we are dealing with.
There you go. So we'll bust right into it. There seems to be an obsession with how Trump's tariff plan is impacting the markets and how it might impact U.S. consumers. Talk a little bit about if and how it sort of reshapes the world order. Specifically, what are the geopolitical ramifications in terms of our relationships with other nations?
Yeah, I mean, this is yet one more component of something you and I have been nibbling around, which is the reputational capital of our country, right? I mean, other countries around the world align with us and do our bidding in part because we're strong and in part because they believe that we are, like, we'll actually do what we say, because they have a level of trust and confidence that we will act as we say we will act going forward. And we've done an awful lot to shake the ladder over the past weeks, whether it is the way we treat judges or law firms or universities or green card holders in the United States, or whether it's the way we treat territorial integrity in Denmark and Greenland and Panama, in Canada, or it's the way we treat our treaty obligations, our tariff obligations, our trade relationships, our partners, our allies. I mean, all of these things, we're basically saying to everybody else around the world, look, we're stronger than you are. So that's all that really matters is what we say, and you're going to do it. And it can be arbitrary and capricious, and we can change our mind, 3 times before breakfast, as through the looking glass days, right? That's kind of where we find ourselves, is through the geopolitical looking glass.
Who do you think? Well, let's talk about outside of the U.S. Who are the biggest winners and the biggest losers? And let's just assume that we agree that Ukraine is probably a loser so far. But I'm just with respect to tariffs. Who do you think the biggest winners and losers are abroad?
Scott, the biggest winners are nobody. I mean, honestly, if you're looking at the last 50 years that created this unparalleled period of global growth, improved efficiency, lower prices, and an emerging global middle class that unlocked human capital that everyone in the world could benefit from, you're undoing that. So, I mean, some countries are going to get hit in the face and knocked out, and others are just going to have a glancing blow and they can keep walking. But you wouldn't call the latter winners. You just say they aren't really losers. So in that regard, there are a lot of countries, I think, that'll be just fine. I mean, India, for example, in this environment will be just fine. They're taking a hit from the U.S., but it's not going to matter much for their growth. Maybe, sort of 20 basis points, max half a point of GDP for a very strong growing economy. They'll benefit from all of the unwinding between the U.S. and China, and a lot more people will end up going in. So on balance, like net, India should be okay. Gulf states, everyone has to work with them no matter what. They're rich, they're pretty diverse, they're stable. Trump is going out there shortly, going to visit Saudi, UAE, Qatar. They feel pretty comfortable with him. That's going to be fine. They can deal with, a slight increase in tariffs. The longer term, there are some winners. There are some big winners. The Mexicans and Canadians long-term are winners because they will find ways to ensure that USMCA gets renegotiated, and that will create more post-crisis tested resilience for the most important integrated common market in the world. And China long-term will also benefit because the United States will have given up so much reputational capital, and China will be able to take advantage of that, particularly in the global South, but also to a degree in Asia, the Japanese, the South Koreans, to a degree in Europe. But in the near term, China gets hit really badly. In the near term, Mexico and Canada get hit really badly. In the near term, the United States is the comparative winner, and I expect that to be reflected in the markets.
So I think it's hard to argue that international trade or free trade over the medium, there's some short-term losers in specific industries, but over the medium and the long term, I would argue it's probably been the biggest economic unlock of the last 100 years. And that it's not a zero-sum game, and that, prosperity elsewhere, we make something really well, they make something really well for less money, and we trade. I wonder if actually sooner rather than later, I see the biggest winner as China, because I would imagine, and I believe, Chinese diplomats and economic ministers are roaming the world saying, you may not love us, but you can count on us. I think they're just going to scoop up so much trade that it'll not only replace what they lose from the U.S., it'll net that it'll be a positive actually pretty soon in terms of, I just saw that Japan and South Korea are having discussions with China for the first time in a while. I wonder if China is a really big winner here. Your thoughts?
I think it's the right question to ask, Scott. I always like our conversations because you immediately get into the important issues and want to thrash them out, right? I take the other side of that. First of all, on the Japan, South Korea, China discussions, which were discussions among their trade ministers, they certainly, in an environment where the U.S. is raising tariffs with reckless abandon and may not be willing to undo them, at least not immediately. These are countries that trade a lot with each other and need to make sure that that trade is comparatively frictionless, or at least has less friction to it. So I do think there'll be more coordination, but they won't coordinate policies vis-a-vis the U.S. because the Japanese and South Koreans still really need the U.S. in technology and particularly in security, and they don't trust the Chinese on that, and that's not going to change. But the more important point is that China is seriously underperforming economically. And if the United States is getting involved in a trade war with China, in other words, if the additional 50% actually gets implemented, and I know that Trump says it's happening as of midnight on the day that you and I are now speaking, he could easily decide, you know what? We're going to talk to them. They just called me. They just set up a call. It's going to be great. It'll be fine. I'll make it okay. Maybe he suspends that. Maybe he kicks it down the road. But let's assume that what he said actually stands and he actually implements that. That is a trade war that the Chinese can afford a lot less than the Americans can. They have a lot less leverage. They do have more patience. Maybe they have more political stability in the long term. They certainly have a leader that's going to be in place for a lot longer. But their domestic economy is not working. Their population is not buying. They don't want to spend because they don't trust the government and they don't have consumer confidence. They are manufacturing a lot and they're dumping. And they're dumping in a way that is going to be much harder to do given all of these U.S. tariffs, not just against China and against the Japanese and South Koreans, but also against all the countries that the Chinese are exporting to and through to the United States. Some of the countries that got hit the worst were in Southeast Asia. Those are precisely the countries where the Chinese are exporting and getting into the U.S. Well, that's going to get closed down. So I think they're in trouble. I think that there is going to be a lot of capital flight. They've got about $3 trillion in reserves right now. Last time they got a serious financial crisis, they were from 4.5, went down to 3 in 6 months. There is an argument to be made that their economy is going to be truly and unprecedentedly tested. So I think in the near term, they're actually in a lot of pain. And I think that they're going to be careful in not doing further tit for tat against the Americans like the immediate 34% announcement that they made in the hopes that that was going to calm it down. I would take the other side of the China bet.
I think that's super interesting. And I think you've changed my view. I thought China really was the big winner here.
But I think you're right that they're going to be the big winner, but they have to be patient. They have to be able to get through getting really hit in the face by the most powerful country in the world. And it just ain't going to be easy for them. Long term, though, I mean, you can just imagine not only on the stuff we're talking about now, but U.S. leaves USAID, shuts it down. Like, who's dominant? Who's the dominant trade partner of every global South country? That's China, right? Who's going to be able to pick up much more influence over that part of the world? China. U.S. leaves the Paris Climate Accord, says that, climate's not something we're paying attention to anymore. Who's leading the world in transition energy, sustainability, and supply chain? China. Who's going to drive the COP summits going forward? China. So, I mean, I can absolutely see there is a light at the end of the tunnel for the Chinese, for our principal adversary, that's actually really quite dangerous for us. We have to be very careful about that, especially because it's not like they don't know how to do new technology. You saw DeepSeek and that announcement. I mean, they're very capable. They're going to build data centers. They have cheap energy available. I mean, they're going to be competitive with the U.S., even in artificial intelligence. So we've got to be careful. And we're the ones undoing our CHIPS Act, right? Which makes no sense whatsoever, especially if you're trying to get more manufacturing in the U.S. Like, we don't want to build, we don't want to make sneakers. We want to make semiconductors. And you're ripping up the one thing that we have that's going to drive more semiconductor production in the U.S. I don't know why they're doing that. But the Chinese, long term, I think, do have lots of opportunities. I'm just worried about them right now.
We'll be right back after a quick break. Support for Prof G comes from ShipStation. What if you never had to worry about shipping and fulfillment for your business ever again? With ShipStation, you can save hours and money every month by shipping from all your stores with one login, automating repetitive tasks, and finding the best rates among all the global carriers. ShipStation grows with your business no matter how big it gets. You can ship products to your customers with discounts up to 88% off UPS, DHL Express, and USPS rates, and up to 90% off FedEx rates. You can also seamlessly integrate with the services and selling channels you already use. You can deliver a better customer experience with industry-leading scalable features that help ensure accuracy and get shipments out the door faster. Over 130,000 companies have grown their e-commerce businesses with ShipStation, and 98% of companies that stick with ShipStation for a year become customers for life. Calm the chaos of order fulfillment with the shipping software that delivers. Switch to ShipStation today. Go to ShipStation.com and use code Prof G to sign up for your free trial. That's ShipStation.com, code Prof G. We're back with more with our good friend Ian Bremmer. So this has dominated the headlines, and I find that the U.S., we're narcissists. We want to talk about ourselves, and we also, I would say, struggle with or suffer from an idolatry of the dollar. So if the NASDAQ goes down, that dominates the headlines over anything else. Catch us up for those of us who have been distracted from what's going on in Ukraine and in Gaza. Give us a sense for what has happened over the last 4-8 weeks as we have been totally distracted with discussions of the market falling 10%.
Well, let me start with the biggest news this week, which is what's happening in Iran. So you probably saw that the Israeli prime minister, I can make a transition here, just came to the Oval Office. And, he had said we're proactively taking all of our tariffs off the United States, zeroing them out. And Netanyahu, of course, thought his great friend, who doesn't really like him, but nonetheless has certainly been a big supporter, Donald Trump, he's going to come to the Oval, and the U.S. will announce that those tariffs will also be removed. And that did not happen. Instead, what happened was the U.S. Said, we're going to keep them on. And by the way, you should be really appreciative because we spend so much money in aid for your military, billions of dollars a year, by the way. Also said, Turkey, Erdogan, my great friend, so trusted, really appreciate what he's doing for us in Syria, which of course the Israelis are on the other side of. And then said, by the way, we're going to open direct negotiations with Iran, with the Iranian government, which, by the way, is not actually true. The Iranians said they would do indirect talks through Oman, but that if those initial talks went well, they'd be willing to do direct talks with the U.S., which is new. It is actually a concession and is exactly not what the Israeli prime minister wanted to hear. So, I mean, his meeting in the Oval wasn't quite as bad as Zelensky's a month ago when Vance beat him up and everyone went nuts. But it was the worst trip that Netanyahu has had to the United States since the war. There's no question about that. I mean, in a long, long time.
Barely registered in the Western media.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I figured, I mean, and so you now have the United States saying they're going to start negotiations with Iran directly. And they're going to see Iran's in a very, very weak position. One of Iran's remaining proxy fighters in Iraq, the Islamic resistance in Iraq that has been part of the attacks on U.S. troops and others in the region, they have said that they're going to voluntarily disarm because the Americans said they were going to blow the crap out of them. So you've got the U.S. fighting the Houthis. That was the whole Signal Gate thing from a couple of weeks ago. And that hasn't been very successful so far, but certainly trying to deal with that. Now you have the Americans. Hezbollah is gone. Israel took care of them. Hamas has obviously been blown up consistently over the last year plus. And now you have the U.S. going to the Iranians and saying, we're willing to negotiate. And if it doesn't work out, there's going to be hell to pay. But the intention is not to engage in military strikes. The intention is to try to see if you can do something better, something bigger and broader, and more lasting than the JCPOA, the nuclear deal that was signed under Obama. That was a multilateral deal. This would be a bilateral deal. But that's probably the most important thing that has changed in the last few weeks on the geopolitical front.
Ukraine.
So the Ukrainians, I mean, the news today is that there were 2 Chinese citizens that the Ukrainians captured that were fighting with Russia. It's a non-issue. It's not like the People's Liberation Army had sent them there. There are Americans that citizens happen to be fighting in Ukraine too. And that's because they have the right to leave and travel and whatever. The Ukrainians have accepted the ceasefire terms provided by Trump with no conditions. The Russians have not. And that is something that is increasingly irritating Trump. He's been more than willing to engage directly with Putin. There's been a lot of back and forth between Putin's advisors and cabinet, including the head of his sovereign wealth fund, Dmitriev, who just actually came. He was sanctioned and has a visa suspended, but he was just allowed to come in. An exception made a few days ago to the White House, where he had good conversations with Steve Witkoff, the special envoy, and others. So the Russians are very interested in doing a deal with the Americans and getting investment from the Americans and pulling sanctions off, of course, but they have not been willing to accept American terms for a ceasefire. And Trump has now said a couple of times, I'm running out of patience here. So you need to accept a ceasefire, and it doesn't require me pulling sanctions off, and it doesn't require Zelensky leaving office because he's there and you've got to deal with him, or else I'm going to put much tougher sanctions against Russia. He has not yet at least said, or else I'm going to send much more military support to Ukraine, something he had said before he was elected, hasn't come back to that. But certainly Zelensky's position with Trump and the U.S. today is dramatically better and more normalized than it was when he visited the White House in that shambolic meeting a few weeks ago.
What's actually happened on the ground over the last couple of months in Ukraine?
They've lost a tiny amount of territory. The Russians continue to make territorial gains, but every month they're making smaller and smaller gains. So you would say that the front lines have mostly held. The exception is that small amount of territory inside Russia around Kursk that the Ukrainians had suddenly quite surprisingly taken with the cost of about 40,000 men being redeployed to that area. Most of those men have now had to withdraw, and the Russians have retaken almost all of their territory.
You said on a previous podcast that, this was just not sustainable for Ukraine. And I like the Lincoln quote that you can't win a war without public support and you can't lose a war with it. Has the mood changed at all in Ukraine? Or, at some point in its buff of World War II history, it strikes me that Russia's core competence is just the willingness to endure a lot of pain. Do you see any evidence over the last couple of months as this kind of meat grinder continues to grind on that this war is losing support in Russia, or is it the same as it always was and you still hold to Ukraine as, running on borrowed time?
I hold to both, but there have been small shifts. In Russia, less of a shift. The Russians have just finished yet another call-up of reservists, of troops, hundreds of thousands, which they do every year, but they had no problem in getting those numbers. They're also spending a lot more money on getting troops to the front. They've increased the bonus salaries dramatically, sort of 50x what the average Russian worker could expect in an entry-level job, and that's made a difference too. Certainly no demonstrations on the ground in Russia or any opposition to what you're seeing, despite the fact that they've, had like 1 million casualties, which is just an astonishing number, right? Again, not dead. Dead is more in the 100,000 plus, but still, the impact that has on society in Russia is so meaningful, and it just shows how much control Putin has over the country, over the information networks, all of that. Now, for Ukraine, it's interesting. Militarily, they're still going to run out of steam come summer, and certainly they're having a harder time with their own raising of reserves, and they're only they still haven't. The age of the call up, I think, went down from 28 to 25, but they have been very reluctant to go to 21 or 18. It's enormously unpopular, and that's problematic for them. Zelensky's popularity, which had been trending downward somewhat, though it was still like in the 50s, 60s, is now back up to high 70s on the back of that trip to the White House, where he stood strong and refused to end up signing what was seen as an exploitative critical minerals deal, and giving back as good as he got effectively from Trump and Vance. So if there were elections in the near term, and constitutionally there can't be because there's martial law, because a big piece of their territory is occupied by foreign invaders. But if there were elections today, it's very clear that Zelensky would win. And I think that actually makes it easier for him to start negotiations with the Russians and not fear that he's going to be ousted domestically. So he actually has somewhat more flexibility diplomatically, even though his military position hasn't improved.
That meeting was such a low point for us being the U.S. Let me outline what might be a Pollyanna scenario, and you tell me if there's anything, if there's any veracity or any hope that this might come to fruition. The EU is a $19 trillion economy combined. Russia is a $2 trillion economy. It's smaller than Canada's economy. That if the recognition that the military umbrella of the U.S. no longer applies, that we're not going to weigh in, and that we have become an inconsistent, sclerotic partner that, rich Uncle Sam cannot be counted on. He's lost his shit. And the EU, for the first time, Europe becomes a union, increases their defense budget, as they've announced, from 1.9 to 3%. They don't have the surface-to-air capabilities. They still need the U.S., but they do have a great manufacturing base. French, UK, and German companies, if Germany makes an amazing car, they should be able to make an amazing tank, and they do. And they're able to actually push back on Russia without the aid of the U.S. And, glory to the EU. Am I smoking my own crack pipe here?
No. There's definitely a lot more that the Europeans can and should be doing. And they've become more unified around the EU because of Trump. Trump is a great unifier. He's unifying the Canadians, who, now the liberals are likely to win. Poilievre, the conservative, was a slam dunk. And Trudeau, of course, after 10 years, had lost all of his credibility. And yet the Canadians have completely unified against the United States. Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, 85% approval ratings right now. Why? Anger with the United States. The EU, much stronger now, favoring the EU, spending more, supporting their own defensive capabilities, investing more in technology, and hitting the Americans back on tariffs because of what they see coming from the U.S., not just in terms of economic policy, but also in terms of undermining their own democracies in Europe, algorithmically, direct support from Elon, from Vance, from others, for people like the AfD, who are considered a neo-Nazi party in Germany, and support for Russia. So all of those things are making the Europeans do more. But is more enough? Is more enough? Because, Scott, the Europeans have not spent on defense for 40 years, right? Almost 40 years. And so it's not like, okay, now they're going to spend 3%. Okay, so how long is it going to take them to get to the point they can defend themselves? Now, defending themselves against a $2 trillion Russian economy, frankly, isn't all that hard. Russia will do asymmetric things. They will engage in cyber attacks. They will engage in espionage. They will blow up critical infrastructure. They're already doing that. They'll use a network on Telegram to order a whole bunch of local citizens to commit crimes, arson, vandalism, you name it. But they're not going to send tanks into the Baltics. They're not going to send tanks into Poland. They get crushed. So that's not what I'm worried about. But can Europe rebuild fast enough that they could defend the Ukrainians in a Russian war that the Russians are completely committed to? And the answer there, I think, is no. I think that answer is no. And I also don't know whether the Europeans spending more on defense are going to stay aligned enough to allow them to become independent from the U.S. defensively in 5 and 10 years' time, given that there is a vastly greater level of security concern in countries that are not economically performing well, unlike the United States, that aren't productive, that don't have big tech, that don't have entrepreneurship. I mean, if you're Spain or Italy or even France, how much are you prepared to spend in your tightly contested budget on long-term defense? Are you willing to spend the way the U.S. does? The answer is probably not. What about Germany? They've made some enormous announcements to get rid of their debt brake. But the new government that's coming in, assuming they can put the government together, and by the way, everyone assumes that Merz is going to have no problem putting that government together. There's like probably a 10% chance that he fails in constructing a government, right? And then we're in a very, very different place. But assuming he does in the next month-ish, that the fact that they have the debt brake gone doesn't mean that they're going to spend all that money, doesn't mean they're prepared to actually change EU borrowing rules to allow them to. It's going to be a very weak government. So as I look forward 3, 4, 5 years, I still see a significant likelihood that in many of the countries you're talking about, we're going to end up with more Trump-aligned, Orban-aligned, Milei-aligned, Bukele-aligned governments that get elected in Europe, which weakens the EU, which makes it harder to talk about a collective security among the European states themselves, a coalition of the willing.
We'll be right back. Support for Prof G comes from Vanta. Trust isn't just earned, it's demanded. Whether you're a startup founder navigating your first audit or a seasoned security professional scaling your GRC program, proving your commitment to security has never been more critical or more complex. That's where Vanta comes in. Businesses use Vanta to establish trust by automating compliance needs across over 35 frameworks, including SOC 2 and ISO 27001 centralized security flows, complete questionnaires up to 5 times faster, and proactively manage vendor risk. Vanta not only saves you time, it can also save you money. A new IDC white paper found that Vanta customers achieve $535,000 per year in benefits, and the platform pays for itself in just 3 months. You can join over 9,000 global companies, including Atlassian, Quora, and Factory, who use Vanta to manage risk and improve security in real time. For a limited time, our audience gets $1,000 off Vanta at vanta.com/ProfG. That's VANTA.com/ProfG for $1,000 off. We're back with more with our good friend Ian Bremmer. So you brought up Canada. I'm curious to get your thoughts on Prime Minister Carney.
Well, he's a friend. I'm completely biased in that regard. I've known him for a long time.
You strike me as very Canadian.
Most Canadians don't strike me as very Canadian.
No, you strike me as Canadian.
Oh, me?
Oh, 100%. You're very...
What the hell does that mean? I think I'm almost offended by you saying that. What do you mean by that?
Super friendly, super nice, educated, pretty easy to get along with.
Okay.
Exceptionally Caucasian.
If you said Canadian, like a bit of a weenie, I would be I'd be a little upset, that would be...
How do you get 100 drunk Canadian fraternity brothers out of your pool? Hey guys, would you please get out of the pool? By the way, I love Canada. I was conceived in Canada. Let's bring this back to me, Ian.
Okay, good. Where in Canada were you conceived?
In Toronto. And then my parents were sick of the weather. And 7 months pregnant, my mom loaded up her Austin Mini Metro with my dad, and they moved to San Diego. I'm actually thinking, and I'm going to rope you into this, I want to do an I Love Canada tour, and I want to get together.
I would be good for that.
You would. I'm thinking Toronto, Montreal in the summer, Vancouver, pick a fourth city, but I would like to do an I Love Canada tour. Anyways, you're signed up and you're included. What do you think of Carney?
Well, look, again, I say it because...
As a fellow Canadian.
Yeah, exactly. He is, intellectually, economically, he is a generational mind for Canada on the global stage. When he was central bank governor in Canada, when he was central bank governor in the UK, right, through Brexit, this was a guy that was respected incredibly highly by every other major interlocutor, by the entire G7, by all of the CEOs of the financial institutions, by the central bankers. They all have a lot of time for him. He's the one Canadian that Macron seriously respects at a high level. Christine Lagarde thinks the world of Mark Carney. All of that. And at a time when the Canadians are facing an unprecedented challenge economically from their most important trade partner, you understand why so many people are suddenly flipping towards him. And, until very recently, we really thought Poilievre was going to win. Because again, the Liberals have so outlived their welcome in Canada. But it's interesting, bringing Carney in and getting rid of Chrystia Freeland, who was the deputy prime minister, is what the United States didn't do and what the U.S. needed to do, right? You had Biden, who had completely outstayed his welcome and was completely incapable and incoherent at the end. And instead, they brought in someone who was basically undifferentiated from Biden. When asked, what would you do differently? The answer was absolutely nothing. This is an anti-incumbent wave, people. You can't run an incumbent. And Biden ran an incumbent and lost, even against a very unpopular Trump. And the Canadians got rid of their incumbent, got rid of the deputy. Now they're running an outsider who's probably going to win. And I think he'll end up having a fairly unified Canada, even though it's a different system. It's a parliamentary system, and he might have to govern in coalition because everyone in Canada is so incredibly angry at the United States, so incredibly unnecessary, the fight that the Americans have decided to pick with them. Part of the problem I have with what Trump is doing is that he is picking every fight simultaneously. Right? So if you want to go and reorganize the global trade order at a time when the U.S. economy is particularly strong, then you should also be leaning into U.S. industrial policy at home. So don't get rid of the CHIPS Act, expand the CHIPS Act. It was too small to begin with, right? Don't go after American universities, expand funding in American universities because you need the best talent from around the world, not to stay there, but to come to the United States. Don't undermine rule of law. You need people believing in rule of law and contracts. In other words, make the consistent bet. But the only consistent thing is that Trump wants to beat up on everybody all at the same time. And that unfortunately, even for the most powerful country in the world, is going to end up hurting us a lot. And beating up on the Canadians was really among a lot of stupid things, it was the stupidest thing that we could do.
Yeah, the people, you mean the people who hit us in the Iran hostage crisis, largest undefended border? Just talk about head up your ass. I agree with you. I love that saying that I've been quoting a lot. It's attributed to Churchill, but I think it was actually Victor Hugo. The only thing worse than fighting with your allies is fighting without them. We've essentially decided we're not even just going to fight with allies because we're, to your point, fighting with all of them at the same time. We're now fighting without our allies. Yeah, I apologize for hopping around here, but you mentioned that a lot of nations, unfortunately, or the world seems to be headed towards people like Orban. I've actually been quite inspired by some of the protests in Hungary. Do you think that's more show? My sense is that's pretty powerful. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Orban has, first of all, his economy has performed very badly, and so the people are angry about that. His corruption and his willingness to control with a group of oligarchs key industries as well as the media is something that is not appreciated among rank and file Hungarians, specifically not in the cities. Again, this is kind of like Moscow, right? When you had problems with Putin, it was only the urban center. They did very well in the rural areas and the smaller towns. Hungary, it's the same thing. But in Budapest itself, very easy now to rally large groups of Hungarians specifically against Orban. So he's doing very badly. But I mean, getting rid of him in an environment where he controls so much of the judicial power, so much of the media power, so much in how elections are conducted, you just don't have the checks and balances there, so it's much harder to get rid of him. Look, Turkey, there have been really big demonstrations in Istanbul, not in other parts of the country because they haven't been allowed, and Turkey has just taken a complete big step, a leap, into full-on dictatorship, right, where they have arrested the opposition leader who was about to announce his own run for the presidency and was the one guy that could have beaten Erdogan, and now he's not going to be able to run. And you know what? Trump says Erdogan's his best friend. The Europeans need him, so they're not complaining very much. He's going to get away with it.
So as we wrap up here, let's come back home. And I think of you as someone who's an expert on geopolitics, and domestic politics isn't your focus, but you're able to do something I think 99% of us are not able to do, and I'm certainly not able to do, and that is you're able to separate your emotions from the facts. How do you see this shaping up? Is Trump's current policy so far shaping up for, and I know it's early, for 26 and the general fulcrum or the general power structure between the Democrats and Republicans right now? Any observations?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, you're very kind to say that, Scott. I don't know that I can always separate my emotions from my analysis, but I try to at least be aware of when they're hitting it, and be honest about it when it comes. It's like when you just asked me about Canada, and I'm like, okay, well, let me tell you, I've got an emotional connection there. On the United States, I think that Trump has an opportunity here. I don't know that he's going to take it. You and I both know that the Republican voting base is no longer the free trade, certainly not neocon, U.S. lead the world thing. It is working class, middle class, especially non-college educated, and especially men. And, you talk to a lot of these people, you inspire a lot of these people, especially young people around the country, which I really appreciate. And I think that Trump needs to lean into that. So, the markets are taking a hit. Okay. And portfolios are getting hit. Okay. Well, a lot of the people I just mentioned don't have portfolios, right? So if you made that a feature, you would then also say, we're not doing the extended tax cuts for the highest bracket. We're going to snap those back. And yeah, there's going to be inflation, and these tariffs, to rebalance, the corporations are going to get hit because they've taken advantage. They've taken all the profits. The foreigners have taken advantage. They've done so well. But what about our own middle and working classes? We're going to redistribute the sales tax that we collect on these tariffs. We're going to redistribute that to the poor and the middle class. And I don't think he's going to do that.
And I look at, who are we talking about here?
What?
I was going to say, who are we talking about here?
Well, at the end of the day, it's not like Trump used to be a Democrat. It's not like he has an ideological true north. He's going to make his money anyway. So why not go with the people that really love him? And deep MAGA, right? These are people that actually are hurting that he needs to do more for, and that can't just be throw paper towels at them. But, when I look at what we're seeing from Make America Healthy Again and the food assistance, SNAP, I see, okay, we're going to allow certain states to not give those benefits for soda and for junk food. Okay, I'm fine with that. I mean, I'd love to bring down our type 2 diabetes in this country and obesity, but they're also reducing the benefits. They're also taking away what the Biden administration did to expand them. That's crazy. You can't hurt the poor people in this environment. You got to help the poor people. And so I think because Trump has gotten it right for the majority of the country on the border and illegal immigration. And he's gotten it right for the majority of the country and on identity politics and anti-wokeism. But he is failing most of the country on redistribution to the average American, to the people like my family growing up. He's not helping those people economically. And if he got the trifecta, then he would actually have a shot in the midterms. Absent that, you probably expect the Democrats come back and take the House.
I think you are calling on his better angels. I'm convinced that those first two are nothing but weapons of mass distraction from his ultimate goal, which is to continue to enrich the 1%. That's who he sees at the end of the day as his core constituency. And that
the tariffs don't help them.
Well,
they really don't. They hate him. You talk to Steve Schwartzman, right? And ask him what he doesn't like about Trump, and the number one thing he'll tell you is, I hate his trade policy. And that was months ago. That was before the election. Now, oh my God, these people, their hair's on fire, right?
My sense is tariffs are just blanket stupid and hurt everyone. They especially hurt the poor who spend a disproportionate amount of their money on discretionary items. That, sure, the wealthy will take a hit to their stock market portfolio, but at the end of the day, I think the Republican Party and Trump's genius is an ability to convince the lower 99 that he's serving their interests, because at some point they might be in the top 1. But if I upload my tax returns into ChatGPT and say, under the proposed Trump tax plan, what happens to me? And the answer is, champagne and cocaine, that things only get better for me based on his proposed tax policy. I think tariffs hurt everyone. It's a fair point, but they hurt poor people a lot more. That's just blanket stupid. I wouldn't argue that's any sort of class warfare, one side against the other.
I take your point, Scott. And again, given that's why I'm saying in order to deal with that, you've got to do a redistribution. I do think that long term, tariffs also have the capacity to, as for the most powerful country in the world, to redirect investment and capital into the United States. And I do think that there are
blanket tariffs like this. That never works. When has that worked?
No. Assuming that you use them to actually negotiate and force weaker countries to do deals.
But my understanding is since 2009, we've put in place more thoughtful individual tariffs that are asymmetrically advantage to us than any other nation, 3 times more than Germany, 5 times more than France. That we've been doing exactly what you're talking about. Brazil gets tariffed 82% on their sugar. Our sugar gets tariffed 12%. Japan pays a 25% tariffs to put deliver trucks into us. They charge us 0%.
And we're mostly, there are counterexamples to that, of course, but also, and that's why we get so...
We're not the victim here. We're the oppressed.
No. We're clearly not the victim. In services, we run massive surpluses 100%. And our economy is tilted towards services. And why would we want to go back to manufacturing, given where the global economy is heading?
We don't want to make Nikes. We want to wear them, right? What Dave Chappelle said.
Absolutely. But my point here is that I don't see Trump as necessarily needing to support the top 1%. I see Trump supporting himself and his family, and a small number of donors. That's a handful of people. He's very transactional for that. I get that. But if you want to close the border and take out illegal immigrants, the easiest way to do that could build a lot of support is go after the corporations that are actually bringing in all the...
Tax the employers.
Just tax the employers.
But again, he doesn't want to go after the employers or the corporations or those nice people who are. That's always been the case with immigrant. I could go for a mile. I think illegal immigration is the most profitable part of immigration. We've turned a blind eye.
It's a real problem. So it turns out that we are more kleptocratic than authoritarian, and that is probably, I guess, ultimately better for the American civilians, but not by much.
Okay, respond to my conspiracy theory here. Trump sets up essentially a Swiss banking account where you can put money in, and the person who puts money in can call you and say, by the way, I'm about to make you the wealthiest man in the world. What do you think about withdrawing support from Ukraine? By the way, I'm also going to make you the wealthiest man in the world. Maybe do something that thrusts potential trading partners into our arms. My conspiracy theory, Xi, China, and Putin, Russia, have committed to buying massive amounts of the Trump coin in exchange for him levying a set of decisions that see just massive political and economic advantage to Russia and to China. I would ask the following. If Putin and Xi had been elected president and vice president, what would be different about what's going on right now?
Yeah, me no like the Trump coin. I mean, that's obviously yet one more completely opacity-driven means for corruption and enrichment of Trump and his wife, and that's not where the country should be heading. I mean, the country would look very different if it was run by Xi and by Russia. I mean, first of all, we wouldn't be announcing 124% tariffs against China, right? So, I mean, I think that let's take the China piece out of your conspiracy right away. He's done a lot more with the Russians, but you don't need, if you don't need a conspiracy theory to explain something, don't use one. It's additive. And, it's complicating. It's a complicating factor. There are a lot of reasons for Trump to be doing what he's doing with Putin, irrespective of that, right? I mean, he doesn't like the EU. He wants the EU to go away because they are a strong, coordinated group with trade competency that undermines his influence on the global stage. He wants to deal with a bunch of individual, smaller, weaker countries much more than he wants to deal with the EU. And by the way, Putin agrees with that completely. So also when he meets with the European leaders, it's like Obama. They are educated, they're effete, they don't respect him, they snigger behind his back. He got the intelligence on those conversations. He knows what they really say about him. Putin, actually like MBS, kind of treats him just like one of the guys. So, I mean, Trump actually does enjoy talking with Putin more than he does enjoy talking with Macron or Schultz or Starmer. And so I think that gets you a fair amount of the way. And then it is true that if you look at the Riyadh conversations that the Americans had with the Russians a couple of months ago, Russia sent a couple of cabinet ministers, but also sent a businessman who was said to be an advisor to Putin, but he also happened to have bought, coincidentally, a really expensive apartment from Trump that he spent a lot in Florida.
Oh God, how did we get here? Literally, how did we get here?
Right. So, I mean, I do accept, Scott, that like with MBS, which is where Trump is again making the first trip, that if there is a deal made with Russia, the cash register will be open. That unlike the Europeans who can't deliver money directly to Trump and family, the Gulfies can, and the Russians can, and they will. But I don't think China's any part of that deal remotely.
Don't we just start circling the drain when you allow certain levels of corruption, that the incentives are just for everyone to be corrupt? That if you decide not to buy Trump coin or send Trump money, you end up on the wrong side of the largest purse and the strongest military in the world. Isn't this just a downward spiral?
I really don't like the fact that the United States is setting the example for kleptocracy. I don't like the fact that the wealthiest man in the world, who you are no fan of, is occupying a position of authority in the United States, in the White House, at the same time that he is running and owning those companies, however well or badly. And I remember when he met with Modi during the state visit at Blair House, so, part of the White House, right? And Trump is then asked in a press conference by a member of the media, said, so when Elon met with Modi, was that in his official capacity or was it in his private sector capacity to advance his business interests? And Trump, God bless him, actually answered honestly. he said, I don't know. I mean, how could he know, right? I mean, neither, both. What does it matter, right? And I mean, so we have this. It's a very serious problem. Most powerful country in the world, and the most wealthy person in the world is conducting business and government affairs simultaneously, interlinkedly. Like, that's not okay. And he's going after Schumer, saying he's corrupt and has fraud and has given no evidence, at the same time that his companies are benefiting from billions of dollars of direct contracts from Pentagon and NASA. I mean, that's clearly a conflict of interest that we should have no part of.
Yeah, and calling Senator Kelly an astronaut and an outstanding patriot, a traitor. But anyways, you're an amazing father, Elon. Ian, give me something to be hopeful for here. What have you seen recently that gives you hope?
I've started to see, so I think the markets do create a level of honesty in people that we don't necessarily see on a day-to-day basis.
So the adult in the cabinet right now is the Dow and the NASDAQ, isn't it?
I mean, basically, right? I mean, Jamie Dimon is saying he sounds a lot differently this week than he did at Davos, right? And I don't think that is courage. I think that is, his deep strategic revealed interest being, made public. And if we could do more of that, I mean, there's got to be pain, there's got to be crisis, but there might just be enough economic incompetence in all of this crisis to start hearing a little bit more pushback. And I think that would be a useful thing. Look, I mean, the fact that Elon is really at odds with Trump Navarro on the most disruptive thing they've done so far is helpful, frankly.
The most disruptive thing being immigration? What are you referring to?
No, on tariffs.
On tariffs, excuse me. Thank you. Ian Bremmer is the president and founder of Eurasia Group, the world's leading political risk research and consulting firm, and G0 Media, a company dedicated to providing intelligent and engaging coverage of international affairs. He is also the author of 11 books, including the New York Times bestsellers Us versus Them, The Failure of Globalism, and The Power of Crisis, How Three Threats and Our Response Will Change the World. He joins us from his office in, is it Midtown or Flatiron? What would you call it?
Nomad. It's called Nomad officially.
Nomad, very cool. Very cool. Ian, it is always good to hear from you. And let's be honest, you are a Canadian spy. You joined the ranks of Andrew Ross Sorkin. I believe you're working for the Canadian government. It's okay. You will soon again be our allies. Everyone can see me and Canadian spy Ian Bremmer and Andrew Ross Sorkin. We're going to do our I Love Canada tour. You're in. You're committing right now, right?
I am.
You get to pick the first city. Is it Montreal or Toronto?
No, if it's I Love Canada, you got to start with Toronto, of course.
Toronto. All right, brother. It's always good to see you.
Okay, be good, man.
Thanks, Ian.